Yep.
So yeah, this is a co-presentation between myself and Karen. My name is Adam Arling. I'm a white male in my 40s, sitting in a teal-colored office with Chicago snow in the background out the window, sadly.
I'm Karen Shaw. I'm a white female in my 40s with long gray hair and glasses, wearing a black shirt, sitting in a beige room.
So today our presentation is called Case Study Batch Update, User-Driven Approach. And we're going to kind of wrap it in the context of design thinking and talk a little bit about how our work group has been evolving the past few years. So over the past few years, our Northwestern University Libraries development team has experimented with kind of a newish, I guess, for our team workflow for modular development of repository applications. Maybe this would make sense by describing our team. So we're made up of a project manager, a subject matter expert, 3 backend developers, and 2 front-end developers. So when our team approaches a new application feature or issue or something to work on, we see the work from different perspectives. And I think the workflow that we're evolving towards is parallel development and embracing our team's different perspectives. So how can we break down an issue or feature into parts that can be built at the same time?
So what did we do before? We did build batch functionality, both a batch ingest and a batch update in our previous 2 repository systems. But while we did practice Scrum at the time and batch feature was discussed during planning and stand-ups, the process was not user-driven. In general, 1 or 2 developers designed and coded the feature and delivered it as a finished product. Decisions about UI design and flow were made by developers based on what was possible or easiest within the existing framework. The process was not iterative, and the product was often hard to change once delivered. The resulting user experience was lacking. Errors often happened silently, confusing users, and were hard for developers to diagnose and troubleshoot. Some features and operations weren't implemented at all, so users often had to ask developers to run a script to do this or that. Next slide.
So design thinking. What is design thinking? Well, this simple description or graphic, I guess, kind of sums it up. Design thinking is a problem-solving technique. In Northwestern, they offer a design thinking workshop, and a few of us in our team have attended this session and thought, why not give it a shot and apply it to what our team's working on? Design thinking has huge buy-in in the tech community and embraces the idea that ideas can come from everywhere, that everyone is creative, and it seems pretty hip. So why not give it a shot? So there's a lot of literature out there on the key tenets of design thinking, but for today, we'll just focus on Google's 3-phase approach, which is empathy, expansive thinking, and experimentation. So empathy, and I think this is said well from the Google design thinking team, they quote, "It's great to create an innovative service, but not so great to build one that's useless to people." So with empathy, users are at the center of design thinking and ought to be the #1 focus. By listening to and really hearing users, we can create meaningful solutions. Expansive thinking, it's more or less brainstorming. The focus is not on arriving at a single perfect solution, but rather to really try and see an issue from every conceivable angle. Expansive thinking is also about thinking really, really outside the box and going big. So instead of aiming for something just a little bit better, really trying to stretch our brains to aim 10 times better, even if this is unrealistic. This exercise alone may open doors to solutions previously unseen. And then after one arrives at or a team arrives at a list of ideas through the expansive thinking phase, you want to see which ideas work and which don't, and you'll want to try to figure this out as fast as possible. And this is the experimentation phase. So you prototype, test, build early stage versions, experiment. Thing as developers, you've all heard, fail fast. And user feedback is crucial to refining the project direction. And I think through experimentation, it makes design thinking a process.
So with this new process in mind, now we'll look at how we are applying it in the case of developing a batch edit feature in our new repository system, Meadow. Next slide. First of all, we needed to understand from a user's perspective what problem we were trying to solve. So we had meetings with users and asked a lot of questions. Next slide. Basically, what we heard was, we want to ingest our assets so that they are tracked in our preservation system and then be able to describe them in large batches so that we can quickly publish them for end user and researcher consumption. So specifically for batch edit, what we heard was our users wanted to be able to quickly and transparently apply metadata changes across thousands of records at once. Next slide. We also heard that we needed to architect a system that addressed some of the frustrations and shortcomings of our old batch systems, or old systems batch functionality, that it didn't scale well. Timeouts and system overloads were frequent. Problems were often silent and completely hidden from users and confusing for both users and the developers trying to troubleshoot. Our users asked for an intuitive, simple as possible UI and the ability to queue jobs, monitor success, failure, and progress of submitted batch edits. Next slide. So once we identified the problem, we began prototyping with wireframes using the Sketch Cloud software. Mostly our wireframes have been authored by our product owner or UI developer, but other team members have created them at times. The wireframes are intentionally unrefined and not detailed because they are work in progress. We don't want users to focus on details at this point. We presented the wireframes to users during feedback sessions and asked for input. This is an example of the wireframing we did for the management dashboard part of the batch edit flow. It shows the very minimal tracking of batches required. We talked about the desire for the whole batch to succeed or fail as a unit. Out of the wireframing discussions, we identified a need to index the batch ID on work records so that affected works could be easily identified with a breadcrumb trail of changes made during batches. We noted this with a sticky. We did not further refine the wireframes as they are just a jumping off point. Next slide. Here's another example that these were the wireframes surrounding adding and removing of controlled terms. They led to many discussions and questions. How to disambiguate same term from different authorities, whether to perform append or replace operations, and how to present selection and confirmation screens to users. Next slide.
Something else we engaged in during the expansive thinking phase was, and actually the phase as well, it's been whiteboarding. So when we used to work on campus in the office, we turned our sprint room, which is our just like a daily meeting room, into a total mess. So you can, it's got the paint on the walls where you can, you're allowed to like write everywhere on them. And we took full advantage of that. So you walk into the room when we were first thinking about how we're going to approach not only batch edit, but other parts of an application we've been working on for the past 18 months. So you'd walk in the room and you see writing spread across all four walls, wireframe printouts taped to service architecture drawings or magic marker system timelines. And when design thinking through batch edit, we, through this process allowed us to address questions such as how and where do we select batch items? How do we handle, say, 10,000 records? How do we handle 25,000 records? How do we track job status, both on the back end and the front end? How do we communicate through job status, the API, and then through the UI to the end user of what is going on in the batch edit process from beginning to end?
So before going too far in one direction, we want to get a working but minimal coded prototype quickly and get it in front of users for feedback. With design thinking like Agile, prototyping is a continual process of generating feedback and iterating, not a one-time thing. Our route to get from wireframes to a working prototype was to start with the API. First, we planned out our GraphQL API, and then we proceeded to mocking it. Defining the shape of the data up front keeps both teams on the same page. Next slide. In the case of batch edit, the design of the API forced a number of team discussions and decisions. In some cases, we had to reach out to end users for feedback and expertise during this stage. Some of the questions and discussions we had, how do we potentially pass thousands and thousands of IDs to the back end? Or do we pass the Elasticsearch query itself? Since we knew we needed to scale very large, we went with passing the query, knowing that it might fall down and we'd need to rethink. One theme from design thinking is that the first idea is often a bad idea. How do we prevent race conditions? Should we be querying the GraphQL API or our Elasticsearch API? What about a lag between the two? Who is responsible for scrolling the Elasticsearch results, the front end or the back end? If a user updates a field, is that an append operation or replace operation, or do they have a choice? So during these meetings, while looking at wireframes, the API emerged. Next slide. When we say API mocking, what we mean is that we actually publish our queries and mutations in our GraphQL schema, but return canned or static responses. That way, both the front and back end agree on the shape of the data and can refer to it while working independently. We tried a couple different approaches to mocking, both the back end in the Elixir code and also on the front end using mocks in the Apollo client. This graphic shows our GraphQL schema with the batch update mutation highlighted. So with the API in place, we are ready to start prototyping in code. Next slide.
And as we are prototyping in experimentation phase, we're kind of doing this in kind of, I guess, three areas: on the back end, at the API level, and also on the front end. So there's a few areas of the user interface that I'll kind of touch on briefly that we needed to flesh out for batch edit. First, primarily, how do we identify a group of items to even be batch edited? So for this, we experimented with having search be the gatekeeper to batch processing. So through the primary search screen, which there's only one, a user can search, facet, and refine to their heart's content and arrive at a body of works. Most of our users, it is identified, at least for this system, are quote unquote power users and rely heavily on faceting for identifying items and grouping them for processing. So prototyping facet alternative UIs was also a big part of this process. Another UI experiment is how do we provide manual selection of batch items? So say a user is just looking to update the description field on a few items in a given collection. How do we combine search, faceting, and selecting manually items in a reasonably intuitive UI? So here we prototyped a solution of a component managing parallel states or scopes on the front end. One state keeps track of items refined through search and faceting, and another state would keep track of manually selected items. So the experiment here was, how do we keep these two states in sync? Perhaps the biggest experiment we needed to prove out in this batch edit feature was how to keep track of selected items when moving around the application or changing routes. During brainstorming, we considered, again, as maybe we mentioned a few times, like what scale numbers. So what if we're talking about 500 records? Probably not a big deal. 5,000, a little bit more of a big deal. 10,000, 25,000. I mean, what do we do with this? Do we put 10,000 IDs? Do we put that in a query string in the browsers? Into the browser? Do we try to stash this in local storage? Would things just crash? So I guess testing it to design thinking, or as we're working through this, our project managers kind of laid it out one day. It's like, what if we just don't pass anything around and we just pick up the query and kind of move that around? Which seemed to work really well because Elasticsearch is fast. So the idea that we prototyped, which we had no idea whether it would work from beginning to end, is that as the user, they search and pass it, and then when their final query is done, then we capture that, which is just a JSON object. And this JSON object we pass around the application. So we can re-execute the query only where we need access to the query's records, whether that's on the front end or the back end. Another recent prototype experiment, which we're actually in the process of user testing right now, last week, and then continuing next week, is how to deliver intuitive add, remove, and replacing of batch items in the UI. So the trick here is aligning three things: the API design against a sensible UI for the user to know what makes sense for how to say replace this or remove this. And then finally, to keep that maintained against component and HTML form patterns in the UI that we can spread throughout the application, reuse, and make consistent for further maintenance beyond just building this. And again, as we're experimenting, prototyping, and getting to the point where simple versions are, an idea is relatively stable, to get this in front of end users, what we kind of did is our project manager would run some initial prototypes in the app by end users with some quick feedback. For example, some helpful feedback we received. Some of the beginning stages of batch, for example, was a request to get a quick visual of what the users were actually editing before, say, mistakenly changing the wrong 1,000 items. Users also said they thought it'd be helpful to have some kind of built-in safety check, kind of similar to what GitHub does before you completely wipe out or remove a repository. So as part of the process, we go back to that, and let's just prototype a quick version of what the users asked for. Let's say pull in 25 items from the saved Elasticsearch query that we're passing around, and maybe just a subtle little notification that says, hey, you are about to edit X number of items, just so it's kind of extra clear. And again, this is just an iterative process moving throughout.
So as a result of our initial prototyping process, we knew that our batches needed to take place within a transaction. An entire batch succeeds or fails. We knew we needed a simple batch update mutation in our API with replace, add, and delete operations that also takes an Elasticsearch query. We knew that we needed to iterate over the Elasticsearch scroll and apply changes to each page of work IDs within one transaction. Next slide. So this made it easy to break up the backend work into iterative pieces to be worked on independently by developers. First, we implemented batch add and delete of controlled terms, then batch add and replace of non-controlled terms, collection assignment, and finally, we are still in the process of implementing queuing and batch management functionality. At each step, as the work is finished, we replace the mock endpoints with working functionality. Next slide. So right now, the state of our batch edit is that it's about 80% done. So here are some of my thoughts about the process, keeping in mind that it's still in progress. Does our process work? In the end, we have to ask our users if they are happy and then keep refining our process. We have to remember to keep our process flexible, not rigid. Keep the things that work and trash the things that don't. I thought the wireframes were a great way to get a prototype in front of users quickly for feedback. I thought the API design and mocking did help keep the UI stable and both teams working at once, but it had a few downsides. The mocking took time. It was more complicated than maybe it should have been, or it's possible that we just haven't found the right set of tools. The Apollo client mocking seemed especially involved. On smaller features, developers are tending to skip the mocking and just proceed to coding. There's also the question of whose responsibility is the mocking? Is it the front or the back end? It seemed naturally that the backend developers had a little more idea of the shape of the data in the API, but when you're using the Apollo client, that's the JavaScript tool on the front end, so it just became a little unclear. The API did evolve a little bit with things we didn't anticipate, but in general, it remained pretty solid throughout development and worked pretty well as a contract between the front and the back end. Another thing we seemed to struggle a little bit with, that it was sometimes hard to get a minimal working prototype in front of users because it was not working enough to generate meaningful feedback. And this could be because our entire application is greenfield and there's a lot of other sort of unimplemented distracting things. So we're hoping that this gets a little smoother in the future. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think from my perspective, as a UI developer, of does design thinking, is it an asset to the development team? I would say absolutely. And I think any process or problem solving technique in development, which puts the focus on end users, is ultimately probably going to be the most efficient solution. As developers, or anyone that knows developers, know it's super easy for a developer, and I'm guilty of this, we all are, to spend a month, if not more, building something that we think is the most awesome, elegant solution. And then when we deliver it, we realize that it's possibly way over engineered and also maybe not what the user necessarily even wanted or possibly even cares about. I also think applying design thinking to this batch editing process, it's good to keep in mind that we're trying to create solutions to pretty complex problems when it comes to the issue of scale on both the front and back ends. But I think a nice thing is that through this iterative experiment and feedback and learn process, I think our team has learned a lot, and we've shifted directions a few times when prototypes didn't quite prove out. And we've been able to pivot reasonably well. And I think as a result of this, we're going to wind up, when this is all said and done, with a much more robust, tested, and somewhat proven product when it's ready to actually go into production for users. And then I think just with design thinking in general, after becoming a little bit familiar with it the past year, I really like the inclusiveness of involving all team members, developers and non-developers, technical and non-technical, and knowing that it's okay and even encouraged to think outside the box about creating meaningful solutions. So for teams thinking about it, I would definitely encourage it. Go for it.